morning, afternoon, evening, 2:37 a.m. Yeah, that's right. I'm talking to you, Megan. Anyway, I hope all of you Megans and non-Megans are having a wonderful day, and if not, I hope it gets a little better now. Although, you've seen the title of the video, so... If you're not somehow aware of what's been going on, this video will have references to sexual abuse of minors, though not in any detail. If that does not sound like something that you can handle, which is totally fine, this might not be the video for you. Although I will hopefully be having some new videos coming up soon about the criminal justice system, why dress codes are stupid, and some things that are not quite so serious. So if any of that sounds interesting, maybe hit subscribe and I will check in with you later. Also, everything that I'm about to talk about, the sources are in the description below, along with some hotlines if you find that you need them. So, with that said, if you are still here, you've been warned, and let's jump into things. If you don't know me, that's very understandable. This is my first main video. But if you want to know a little bit about me, there's a video before this. Kind of fun. I don't know. My name's Scarlett. Hi, how you doing? I grew up in the Catholic Church, and there's a lot that I really liked about it. There's a sense of community and togetherness, and I sang in the church choir for a really long time. I was a cantor in the church, and when I go home, I still sing at church every once in a while, even though that's sort of the extent of my involvement anymore. So there's a lot of positives, but there are some negatives as well. To combat any confusion here, Roman Catholicism is a branch of Christianity. There are about 2.3 billion Christians worldwide, and 1.1 billion of that is Roman Catholicism. So they're the ones who follow the Pope, and all of their priests and leaders are men, and also have been part of one of the biggest scandals ever. Ever. I'm not going to be criticizing anything about, like, belief systems or anything in the Catholic Church in this video. I mean, I have a couple notes, but that's not what this is about. So what I have a problem with is the system supporting abuse. There are other problems, but we're going to focus on this specific abuse and briefly touch on a few other things as we go. I distinctly remember being like 4 years old, and I stood up on a pew before Mass. Pew's like a fancy bench. And I yelled, "Where is God? I don't see him." Which was probably really embarrassing for my mom, but people laughed, you know? I think it was around that time when I was learning what you do when you have a guest, and God had not offered me juice or snacks yet, so I was a little offended. And it was funny thinking about it, but right now it's also a little bit poignant, you know? In a system where people are supposed to be leaders and representatives of God, where is he when this is happening? You know, where's that mentality and the goodness that's supposed to come with what being Catholic stands for? So I kind of want to get into that, and kind of brings us to what exactly is happening. The reason I'm talking about this now is there's news coming out of France that 330,000 people within 70 years have been victimized by clergy and priests. There are about 39 million Catholics in France, which is about 60% of the French population, and there are also about 59-60% of the global Catholic population. So that makes this scandal a really big deal beyond the obvious atrocities that already make it one. So all of this came out in the Independent Commission on Sexual Abuse in the Church, CIASE, that states, quote, "For a very long time, the Catholic Church's immediate reaction was to protect itself as an institution, and it has shown complete, even cruel indifference to those who have suffered abuse." It's worth noting that the reason this investigation was done was that some officials within the church had requested it, so not everyone is complicit in the scandal and the cover-ups that we're going to talk about. This isn't just limited to France, as I'm sure a lot of you know. It's been decades, and they've found cases like this all over the world in different countries. And actually CNN has a lovely timeline that they made back in 2019, so let's take a look at that. The first priest to be accused of sexual misconduct was in 1985. He confessed to 37 cases and was convicted of 34 and still got out of prison after only a decade, despite a 20-year sentence. This wasn't the first accusation, which actually goes back to the 1950s, but it is one that gained traction and brought attention to this issue as a whole. And then there was an investigation in 2002 which brought more horrendous findings, including one priest with 130 accusations against him. A Boston Globe article found local settlements and silent dismissals of priests after about 70 of them were found guilty over a 10-year period, and they were listed under things like sick leave, absent on leave, or awaiting an assignment. And that's not to say that some of those weren't actually true, but there were some suspicious ones for sure. 7 years later, similar findings came out of Ireland. And then in 2010, Austria, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, Switzerland, and Brazil also had cases. 2018 was a really busy year. Reports out of Chile ended up with a summit being called, and all Chilean bishops offered to resign, even though only 5 resignations were accepted by the Pope. And then 300 cases in Pennsylvania were found where predator priests were covered for by bishops, and bishops fall just above priests in the hierarchy. I'll show you here. Ding. Then 1,600 priests in Germany were found to have abused 3,600 people from 1946 to 2014. So very clearly this hasn't been going on just recently, it's been going on for decades. And then recently, former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, who used to be in charge of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., was criminally charged for abuse against a minor. The dioceses are basically like districts where all of the churches fall under a certain purview, so it's like bishops oversee dioceses, and then archbishops oversee archdioceses, and archdioceses are usually bigger areas, so like Los Angeles has an archdiocese, if that makes any sense. He became the first cardinal to be charged, and that's pretty significant, because if you remember the hierarchy we were just talking about, he is like right below the Pope. So it took a really long time to get him charged, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but it's significant, and we'll leave that kind of as it is, that he was charged while being a higher up in the church. All that said, only about 5% of priests overall have been found to be accused of these crimes, which is pretty much on par with the known average in other places. So it's not like there's a higher concentration of priests that have been accused of this. Like, I think a lot of people think that that's the case, but it is significant for other reasons that we're going to get into. I've skipped a lot of history and a lot of details because there's just way too much. So if you want more information, there's plenty of resources around, but I cannot cover all of that. We've got to ask now, how is this possible? How did one priest have 130 accusations against him? You remember former Cardinal McCarrick we just talked about literally a few seconds ago? Well, it was found that when he was in the Diocese of New Jersey, which is where he was at the time of the crimes, a lot of the bishops covered up the crimes and paid off money in settlements to the victims, which is pretty much what happens a lot. People are either paid off with settlements or priests are shuffled around so that people don't know. They're often sent to be, what is it called? Chaplains. I always forget that word. To be chaplains in prisons or hospitals. And around 1992, they sort of stopped this practice, at least that's what they say, and they were weeding out some of the bad priests quietly so it didn't draw any more attention. The other thing that's worth mentioning is the no, don't tell mentality between priests and bishops, and the fact that the bishops were covering things up for the priests, knowingly allowing more of these crimes to take place or not letting priests or forcing priests to be charged and not going to the police. So the cover-up wasn't just not telling their superiors, sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't, but also keeping it from any sort of legal ramifications. We have the how and the what, and I think now a lot of people want to know why. Why is this happening? And to discuss that, I want to go back to what I touched upon just a second ago, policing. And now I know this is another humongous topic, and I'm going to hopefully do another video on it very soon, so I'm not going to get too deep into this whole discussion, but there are certain points that I at least think relate when you talk about the boys' club style subculture that you see in that. My thesis in college was about the police subculture and how it affects interactions between police and minority communities, and so I sort of can see these parallels, and I want to talk about it with you. So, to quote myself, the police culture involves the common beliefs, value, and norms of police that inform and govern their behavior and thoughts. This culture, more commonly known as the police subculture, creates a sense of solidarity among officers. This bond also serves to separate police from the community as it strengthens the us versus them mentality. Unfortunately, this subculture is often toxic. I'm going to discuss a lot more reasons for that in the video I make about this, so you don't have to take my word for it, though. I have some sources about this in the description as well, specifically labeled. But basically, the subculture stresses loyalty and brotherhood and what's known as the blue wall of silence, which encourages, if not, forces officers to keep this solidarity and silence and even help cover up situations when some of their peers do terrible things. And I think we can see that in the way it relates to priests, even though it might be more loyalty to the institution than loyalty to the individual that we see in policing. When men become priests, they promise obedience and celibacy. They often live in housing to them provided by the diocese, and they can be alone or with other priests. Women can be nuns, they can be lectors, cantors in the church, but they can't be clergy. And for the longest time, about 1,000 years, men who were priests were not allowed to be married. Important thing to note. Generally, it was thought that marriage was like a conflict of interest in some way. I'm still not entirely sure what that means. Like, conflict of interest in the eyes of God. Like they were gonna, buff their stats and tell God they were better. Or practically. I'm not really sure what that means. I'm sure it's out there somewhere, or someone can tell me. I have no idea what that means. But that was part of the reason that they were not allowed to get married. The thing is that the law of the church, which is known as canon law, never actually said that that was a rule. That was just a man-made rule. Whereas the ban on women becoming clergy is, in fact, canon law for the church. There's been a scarcity problem in the church for a while, where men haven't been becoming priests as often or haven't been wanting to become priests. So there were a lot of different options on the table, possibilities. Quote, men born out of wedlock, men convicted of serious crimes, converts, and men who did not meet the age requirements or educational requirements for becoming a priest before. So they were going to focus on potentially all of those sorts of men to become priests to fix the problem, but never women. Although they did discuss it, they said that was a possibility, or that they'd reevaluate it maybe in the future. But since then, nothing has happened, and also there was a push from women in the church to let them vote in summits and things like that, and that motion was turned away, so it's been going well for women in the church. 40% of the abuse that happens at the hands of priests to children occurs in those private housing areas provided by the diocese, so a lot of people suggest just not letting kids be anywhere alone with priests, especially there, and always having one or two adults follow them or accompany them anywhere, which is a great idea, because I think on top of that, my thought is that depending on your level of belief, it could almost be even scarier as a power dynamic than other situations, because I remember being 10 years old, and my friend, we were at confession, and she told the priest that she hadn't been to church in a really long time, and he said that she was going to go to hell, damning a 10-year-old to eternal suffering. You know how you do. And I remember thinking, does he have the power to do that, or is that more just information? Is it him, via him, God is saying, hey, you're going to hell, or does the priest have the power to damn somebody to hell? I don't know if anybody else thought that way, but if they did, it could almost make the power imbalance scarier, because you're thinking you have to go along with anything that this priest tells you to do, because otherwise maybe he could send you to hell forever, and that would maybe be worse. I don't know. Maybe that was just how my thought process was, but I feel like potentially that could make things just a lot scarier. Some people blame celibate life for why all this is happening. I think that's kind of dumb. I think not letting them marry or do anything like that is also dumb. But just, the idea that this entire, decades-long priest scandal thing has been happening because they weren't allowed to get laid just is so off base. I don't know. That's just throwing the blame onto something because it's the only thing there. Dr. Karen Terry, a researcher from John Jay College, along with several other people, put out a report on this topic, and one of the things they looked at was the celibacy issue, and she had this to say. What we can say is abuse occurs in every single institution, in families and everything else. Celibacy exists in the Catholic Church, but not these other institutions. So if you look at something, for instance, like the Boy Scouts, they're very similar in numbers terms of rates and percentages, given what we know. You know, there's no celibacy requirement in the Boy Scouts, so what is your argument there? In 2009, Silvano Tomasi wrote to the UN Human Rights Council and blamed the entire scandal on homosexual priests. He said, quote, "Of all the priests involved in the abuses, 80 to 90% belong to the sexual orientation minority, which is engaged with adolescent boys between the age of 11 and 17 years old." No. I mean, this is the same guy who said, quote, "People are being attacked for taking positions that do not support the sexual behavior between people of the same sex." Oh man, who would think that people would be mad that you're saying bad things about gay people? Wow. He's not the only one who said stuff like this, but, you know, he was one of the people that, you know, got a lot of outrage, the most outrage, I'd say, because of his higher position and the context in which he said this. I mean, he and the Vatican had both since said that they support people of all sexual orientations. I mean, not for, like, marriage, but just generally as human beings. But, you know, the other statements and some of the actions historically would not support that. So, also, like, just saying all the things that he just said about how the scandal is because of homosexual priests does not say what you just said. Anyway, okay. Many of the studies about why priests abused children were inconclusive, although Dr. Terry's research did find that sexual orientation was statistically insignificant. So, we knew that, but not everyone knew that. So now we all know it's not because of gay priests. Anyway, other things found in that research were that there was no difference between the priests who had committed abuse and those who hadn't in terms of personality test, and also there was no overarching mental illness that tied all the abusive priests together. Actually, only 5% of the priests who were found to abuse children were medically diagnosed as pedophiles. The rest just seemed like they committed crimes of convenience, I guess, if you could say that, which is just terrible. But I'm going to read a quote from Dr. Terry here. 80% of those who had allegations of abuse against minors also had some type of sexual behavior with adults. What you see is a lot of crossover. They were acting out sexually. Sometimes it was with a minor, or sometimes it was with adults, but it was not that they were targeting a particular type of individual and seeking them out and trying to get those individuals alone over the course of their priesthood. Generally, it's safe to assume that there are probably more victims than we know about. There are certain studies, and actually I believe the CIASE report had extrapolated some of their data to what they believe could be the number because of the reporting issue. A lot of people don't report for a variety of reasons, and Dr. Ackerman, who was one of the interviewers in the podcast with Dr. Terry, and is also an expert in sex crimes, had said that there are barriers to reporting, like lack of policies and procedures, treating it as a case-by-case problem when it's systemic, lack of transparency within institutions, and belief systems surrounding the institutions like the Catholic Church, USA Gymnastics, and the Boy Scouts that are part of the reason in these situations reporting doesn't happen. The podcast where I found a lot of that information is Beyond Fear, the Sex Crimes podcast. It's a really good listen, so I will link it somewhere in case you want to listen to that episode or any of the other episodes. Part 3, History and Morality. I think a lot of what I found when I was researching and just thinking about it in general is that people often put Christianity and other religions on a pedestal, like a moral high ground, that it does not need to be on. And other religions too. I'm not, just singling out Christianity in this regard, or Catholicism. Just because a religion is religious and there's, the factor of God and belief doesn't mean that you're protected from criticism, we'll put it that way. And so my thoughts are, you got the Crusades and the bubonic plague where people, especially Catholics, were blaming Jewish people for perpetuating the plague and putting stuff in the water, and that's not cool. So there's a history that we have that shows the precedent for Christianity not being perfect, And I would like to think that people would agree with me on that one, that there's not like a clean slated thing here for Christianity, but I feel like people are probably still gonna get mad at me for that. Something else worth mentioning that I would have loved to talk about more in this video, but I definitely don't want to be 17 hours long, and I don't think you do either, is the relationship between politics and religion, specifically American politics and Christianity. And there are lots of other countries where this is true, but I was just wondering, it's really hard in America, I think, to be elected into public office if you're not religious. And it's not like a rule or anything, but it's just something that I think a lot of us have noticed. Here's a list from Wikipedia, I'm going to trust it just this one time, of American presidents and their religious affiliations. And as you can see, pretty much every single president has been Christian. All except for 2 of those are Protestant, but we've got JFK and our boy Joe Biden, who are Roman Catholic. And so I don't know, I was just wondering if that was something that was, important. If it's harder to judge the institution when it's part of how people either get elected or part of public psyche, if that makes it difficult. And I don't want anyone to ever judge a group of people or a religion that practices in good faith just for existing. I think that that's, really cruel. But if we're going to behave this way and think this way and say that not all Catholics are of the mindset or are the behavior set of priests who have been doing this, have been abusing children, then I think we have to extend that same mindset onto people of other faiths and say that they are not their worst members. To this day, Jews and Muslims in America are vilified and treated terribly, often by people who are self-proclaimed Christians. And I promised myself I wasn't going to get into the politics of all of this because that's not what this is about, and I want to keep away from that for right now. But what I will say is that the God I grew up knowing would not condone the hatred towards other people that I've seen in this country and elsewhere. That's all I'll say about that for now, but I don't quite get it. And I think that if we're going to have that mindset and be okay with Catholic people and in despite of bad Catholic priests, that we need to extend that mindset elsewhere. The reason I brought this up, this whole section, and how it related to this video, was because in 2018, when there were the accusations against the Chilean priests that ended up in that summit that the Pope called, Pope Francis' initial response was to deny that the accusations were real and say that, it was a lie. He later walked that back, and then he apologized and said it was all wrong, and he felt really bad. But I thought it was an interesting knee-jerk reaction, because to me, my thought was that either the Pope had an expectation, not just a belief in, but an expectation of a moral high ground for the Church, or he just didn't want bad press, which is also very likely. But I thought under the slim chance that it was that, the Catholic Church wouldn't continue to do this, we shouldn't still be getting reports out of different places, because there was already a history of it happening in many other countries, but out of Chile, I don't think he had heard that one yet, so he was like, no. And if that was the case, then I was wondering if maybe it was because there was a belief that the Church should be better. And I think that that's fair. The Church should be better. It shouldn't be happening still in so many countries for so many decades. But it has, and we have to address it. And it has been addressed to some degree. There was a lot that came out of that summit. Not everything productive, but let's give it a talk. Let's talk about it. So, part 4. What has been done? In that summit in early 2019, 200 Catholic leaders came together to discuss a 21-point list made by the Pope, as well as develop other ideas. I'll be honest, some of the things on that list were kind of confusing to me. I'm sure they were relevant, but also there were things that I didn't know still existed in the Church, although I guess I should have assumed, like moving up the age of marriage acceptance from 14 to 16. Apparently it was just for girls, because boys it was already 16, but that was something that happened. Another point was to alert both Church officials and civil authorities when things come up, and that's good, although I feel like the police and stuff, the civil authorities are probably a little bit more helpful in this situation, considering what happened when other church officials were told beforehand, like the bishops covering things up. So getting the police involved is a good idea in this instance. I think that's a good thought. Another thing that I thought was very interesting was setting boundaries, like a list of what should be done and what's bad, so that people know how to operate. And I just think that's interesting. We're gonna tell priests that these are things you can't do. I feel like they probably already knew when they were doing the bad things that those things were bad. So making another list of things just to clarify which things are bad probably won't help much, but it's a nice thought. There were some good points, like establish the criteria for the direct involvement of the bishop or religious superior, inform the civil authorities and the higher ecclesiastical authorities in compliance with civilian and canonical norms, be sure to have psychological evaluations by qualified and accredited experts for candidates for the priesthood and or consecrated life. There were several about establishing protocols, kind of like what we were talking about before, which is good. It's a good idea, but it also just depends on what you come up with, right? It's a nice thought, but the result is really what matters, because the protocol, saying we're gonna make protocols is okay. It's sort of the same as increased awareness of causes and consequences of sexual abuse through ongoing formation initiatives of bishops, religious superiors, clerics, and pastoral workers. It's good to be aware, but only if something productive actually happens. What did happen was a lifting of the pontiff secrecy rule, which previously banned information from coming out between the Pope and his papal ambassadors, which are basically diplomats for the church in other countries. So now if something were to come out in those exchanges, it would be able to be, told on a greater scale. That said, the Pope did say he wanted to continue secrecy, or at least respect for those accused until something was found guilty, which yeah. He also said he didn't want to release lists of names of the accused until people were found guilty, and some people had problems with that. For example, I don't know if I'm saying this right. Xaverian brothers released their own list of accused priests in their community, and there were others who did that as well. And that's partially because I don't know, there's reason for people to be concerned about potential dangers in their communities to their children, because while there's a chance that the reputations of non-guilty parties might be damaged, I guess it's balancing that danger with the potential for someone who is guilty to stay in those capacities and not have people know that that's potentially a dangerous situation to be putting themselves or their children in. So I understand that. Also, the plans that were made by the Vatican at that summit and outside of it weren't ironclad. Let me see here. There was still a lot of discretion left to the officials within the churches, or when reports were made or accusations were made, only I think in 5 archdioceses or some number, some really small number, were they letting in or calling in external investigators. Otherwise, they were higher clergy, which sort of seems like a conflict of interest potentially. I'm not saying it always is, but there's potential there for things to not be disclosed. There were other concerns brought up in an AP News investigation, which said that some of the holes in the plan were that background checks for prospective employees did not include the checking the sex offender registry. There was no plan for monitoring, so everything we talked about earlier in the video, how there's no real supervision. There wasn't too much to change that. There are no specifications on what grooming means, so one of the things in their list was that grooming is not allowed, along with all of the other normal illegal things that you're not allowed to do. Now it's definitely banned in the church, even though yeah, but so there's no definition of what grooming means in this capacity. So it's sort of like normal laws, where it's kind of a loophole when you don't flesh out the details. And the last thing was that there are only a few archdioceses that protect whistleblowers, so if someone was to release information or come forward with potential information, they could still be in trouble. After the most recent report coming out of France, Pope Francis has said, "I wish to express my sorrow and my pain to the victims for the trauma that they have suffered, and also my shame, our shame, my shame for the too long incapacity of the Church to put them at the center of its attention." Which is nice and everything, like it's a nice sentiment, but it sort of has the same love and prayers feeling that you get after like school shootings and stuff, where it's like, the sentiment is nice, but unless we actually do something to stop it, it's not going to stop. Back in 2014, he did set up a committee related to the investigation of sexual abuse by priests, but in 2016, they decided not to send senior clerics who helped cover up all of this stuff to tribunal even, so I'm not sure how effective it was. I mean, back to Cardinal McCormick, former Cardinal McCormick, it was like 40 years that they waited to bring that to the attention of actual police. So I feel like there are all of these ideas of like, we need to do something and this is bad and we need to set up like guidelines, but then we have to see it in practice. And I know it's still very recent, like 2014, 2016, it's not that long ago, and a lot of the accusations that happened came from like a couple decades ago. So I'm not saying that it hasn't helped, I'm not saying that, but I think only time will tell. We have come a long way, I guess is what I'm saying though, since 2002 when Pope John Paul II, quote, urged Catholics to focus on the power of Christian redemption for abusers. So, yet again, that mindset is like, we're gonna take the bad priests and then fix them, and that's what we need to do. Like, keep it inside, almost like colleges, you know, how they would rather not tell the police because they don't want their statistics to get all messed up. That's sort of what's happening here. And it's like, you would rather try to fix bad, like, I'm all for rehabilitation in the criminal justice system, that's a fine thing to do, but in this situation, it's something else. I think we all understand why this is a problem. There is a safe environment training apparently offered at a lot of churches for families and children and priests also, and they wanted to clarify it wasn't like a victim blaming thing, but it was just an educational tool, which is good. Education is very good, but the problem that I have is that it's still like a case-by-case solution. We need something that's like bigger. But it's a really good idea. I mean, education is key. Dr. Ackerman from before the podcast said that there are 4 ways to decrease these sorts of crimes, and they are increasing effort, increasing risk, controlling prompts, and reducing permissibility. A lot of the credibly accused priests that were found were not put on the sex offender registry or criminally charged. One by the name of John Dagwell, whose name was on the Xaverian brothers list, moved to a new city and teaches at a university. An NPR article from August of this year said that a lot of what the church has done has been PR related. That said, Pope Francis did make sexual abuse, grooming, child pornography, and covering up abuse criminal offenses. This is what I was talking about earlier, where it's like, that was already illegal, but now it's illegal in the church. I don't know, I guess I just wonder, like, is it enough of a penalty? Like, if someone's an official even in the church, and they're, like, committing these crimes, are they committed enough to the church that losing their position, which is what they would, you know, what would happen if they were found guilty, they would, like, lose their ability to be a part of the church? Is that enough? Like, are they committed enough to the church if they're committing these crimes? Is kind of my point here. I don't think so, but I'm not a priest. One of the victims, whose name I'm not sure I'm saying correctly, is Christian Dubreuil, who is now 65, says that sexual abuse of children is, quote, the perfect crime because it is the only one for which the criminal is sure, or almost sure, that the victim will not report them. And that's what it comes down to, right? Is An institution that's supposed to stand for doing good and being kind has accepted and covered up crimes against a young population who were vulnerable and couldn't speak out for themselves. Dubreuil goes on to say, "I will die with the trauma of what happened, even though it was more than half a century ago." Part 5. What now? So what's my point here? Am I trying to vindicate an entire institution? Absolve it of its sins like it went to confession? Am I really saying we should cancel the Catholic Church? No, neither. I don't think anybody should be crucified for believing what they believe in. And honestly, condemning the Catholic Church wouldn't cleanse the rotten barrel. My point was to look at the trends and analyze the sociological implications of all of the things that we talked about. The no-don't-tell culture between priests and bishops, the effect of the Church's isolating, no oversight design, the power structure of both the Catholic hierarchy and the interactions between clergy and youth, the Church's foundation and history of violence, and the mixed responses from Church officials on everything. It was a system set up to fail, or perhaps it was that expectations of clergymen were better suited for a higher power, because as much as they are holy men, they are, at their base, human. And I'm not making excuses for anyone. What's been happening is inexcusable, but it's something to think about. So is there a solution in all of this? Well, maybe. Some say men should be psychologically evaluated before they become priests. Others say that women should be allowed to become priests or at least be more involved in the church. The CIASE report that we looked at earlier said that money should be given to victims, beyond the hush money, and that there should be a system put in place to recognize those victims who cannot get money because the statute of limitations has passed. Or we could just move the statute of limitations. It's hard because 66% of sexual abuse of children happens between the ages of 12 and 17, and yet the average age for people to come out and talk about these things is 52. If Dr. Terry and the other researchers are to be believed, then psych evals wouldn't really help, because none of the priests that were found accused or guilty really had any difference in personality or mental illness from just a normal person. I think we need higher oversight on all branches, and we need to actually penalize the people involved criminally. And that's, the priest who is committing the crime, anybody helping cover it up, and the institution as a whole. Put them on the sex offender registry. Send them to court. We need to do something bigger. Make the penalty bigger. We could also get rid of the celibacy part. I don't really think that was a big deal, but we could just do that, maybe. And I'm all for women becoming priests if that were ever to be allowed, so long as it didn't end in domestic assault or domestic abuse situations, since the research that we looked at did find that a lot of the priests weren't specifically, pedophiles, and did have other cases with adults. So that's something to think about too. There has to be a change in the system. I mean, right now we're basically just maybe disinfecting it and slapping on a Scooby-Doo Band-Aid, and that's fine if it was a cut, but this is like a gaping wound, right? Like most things, a large-scale problem requires a large-scale solution. An overhaul of the system. And the problem is that it's just not easy, but something has to be done. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you're still here, all of my resources and some hotlines are in the description, along with all of my social media. Like and subscribe and all that jazz if you feel like it. I've got a lot of different kinds of videos coming out soon. I know in this one I listed 17 different topic ideas that I want to go over, so we're gonna have some fun. And also I'm gonna do some not heavy depressing stuff. I want to do a talk about some things, and we can make some skull art or something, because that's what I've been into lately. Also, let me know if you're a Megan at 2:37 a.m. because I see you. I think that's all I have, guys. Thank you so much. What do you think, by the way? Did the Vatican do enough? Did you come to different conclusions? I don't know. I think there's just a lot to say. It was an interesting discussion, so I wanted to have it. If you want to have it, please just be kind. Now I think that's all I had to say. So, sweet dreams, everybody. See you next time.